Thrice never really broke through into the mainstream like Jimmy Eat World or Fall Out Boy did. And they're not really considered one of post-hardcore's pioneers or innovators either, like at the Drive-In or The Refused. Instead, they kind of did their own thing behind the scenes, putting out incredible record after incredible record, and quietly changing the game on their own terms. This is the story of how they did it. It's a story of blistering melodic hardcore and sprawling multi-album, multi-genre projects. It's a story of personal journeys, of spirituality and disillusionment, and of friendships that refuse to die. It's the story of Thrice, true scene leaders who sometimes, unfairly, get forgotten. Thrice began when school friends Dustin Kensrue and Teppei Teranishi decided to form a new band after their former project, Chapter 11, had failed. Teppei skated with a guy named Eddie Breckenridge and invited him to come play bass. Eddie brought his brother Riley along, and Thrice had its first lineup. Actually, it had its only lineup, to date anyway. Thrice has always been Dustin, Teppei, Eddie, and Riley. Hopefully, it always will be. They couldn't think of a name at first, and picked Thrice sort of as a joke. Redditors have suggested the name came from the band's high school friends bragging about beating the classic game Frogger twice, to which Dustin replied he'd beaten it thrice. But this is unfortunately not confirmed. Kensrue himself has said Thrice was just something he and his high school buddies used to say a lot, and it sounded kinda metal. Whatever the backstory, it was only supposed to be temporary, but they ended up kinda liking it. When they self-released their debut EP, First Impressions, Thrice was the name on the cover, and it stuck. The first LP followed shortly after, 2000's Identity Crisis. Despite its title, Identity Crisis is perhaps the most genre-specific album Thrice has ever released. It knows exactly what it is. It's a 90s metal hardcore record released by a bunch of kids who listened to a lot of 90s melodic hardcore. There are flashes of something different, however. Phoenix Ignition is essentially two songs in one. It begins with a ragged boxcar blues-style acoustic passage, and then Kensrue basically sings the whole song through once more, this time in a more familiar hardcore style, complete with gang vocals. It's similar to what bands like Defeater would do a decade later. The seeds of Thrice's influence on the scene were already being sown. Anyway, it's a great record, and Dustin's voice is in fine form. It's a pity then that hardly anyone got to hear it. The original Green Flag record pressing didn't gain much reach. It wasn't until Thrice met with Louis Posen of Subsidy and Hopeless Records that things really started to happen. Identity Crisis got a re-release. Thrice got tours with Sam I Am in Midtown, and the guys got to work on the follow-up record. For most people, it's the Subsidy debut that is their first introduction to Thrice. Illusion of Safety really put the band on the map. There's still plenty of the old Thrice on this record. It's still blistering in its pace, frantic in its intensity. But there's definitely a more post-hardcore approach, a more emo style of delivery. See You in the Shallows is still a fan favorite to this day, and showcases where Thrice were at in the early 2000s. Intricate guitars accompanying soaring vocals. It's still heavy, but it's a little less punk rock. And then there's Deadbolt, one of the defining emo tracks of 2002. It exemplifies Thrice's sound perfectly. The rapid shredding of the guitar drives the track forwards at breakneck speed, pausing only to let Dustin Kensrue deliver his vocal. It's man and guitar duetting, in the most emotionally charged manner possible. Back then, emo was on the cusp of exploding into the mainstream. The underground subculture was close to blowing up. It just needed one band who could push the whole thing over the edge. Was that band gonna be Thrice? It's probably a bit of an exaggeration to say Thrice launched the emo revolution all by themselves. They never quite got enough mainstream attention to make this true, and there were plenty of other bands doing awesome things around that time too. But Thrice definitely helped kickstart it, beginning with their third album and their major label debut. Illusion of Safety had been a big deal, and with emo now threatening to break into the mainstream, Thrice were the perfect pick for a major label trying to get ahead of the curve. Island signed them in 2002, and immediately they began working on the new record. This would be the stunning Artist in the Ambulance, released in 2003. Artist in the Ambulance is an evolution in basically every sense. Thrice poured more influences, more styles, more concepts into the record, and somehow made it work. Usually this collision of elements would be a disaster, but in Thrice's hands, it was a triumph. Tracks like the epic Hoods on Peregrine strip away some of the frantic pace and sound a little like a post-hardcore version of Pearl Jam, albeit in Thrice's inimitable style. The title track strays into pop-punk territory with clean vocals and chugging guitars, while Don't Tell and We Won't Ask goes super epic, as Teppei Teranishi indulges in a bit of stadium rock finger-tapping on the guitar. But Thrice also showed just how heavy they could get. The Abolition of Man sounds like it could have featured on the previous melodic hardcore albums, but carries a bit more metallic weight. Paper Tigers, meanwhile, is probably still the heaviest thing Thrice has ever released. A crushing piece of metalcore on one of emo's most era-defining records. And they weren't done. Touring with a wealth of different punk and emo bands, from Rancid to Alkaline Trio to Thursday and Coheed, Thrice began to hone their idea of what they wanted to do next. Rumors of Teppei learning the piano and whispers that Thrice were leaving hardcore behind began to swirl. And they were sort of right, or at least half right. Visu was released in 2005, sporting an eerie Ouija board cover, and no one quite knew what to expect. Image of the Invisible kicks things off with its gang vocals and scorching guitar. So far, not so much of a departure. But then second track Between the End and Where We Lie arrives, with elements of Kid A-era Radiohead, followed by The Earth Will Shake with its blue rock, gospel-tinged intro. Thrice had done it again. They hadn't exactly surprised everyone. Everyone already knew this was an inventive band capable of anything. But they had pushed their sound forward, and pushed the genre forward too. Every new Thrice album felt like a logical evolution, not a ripping up the script curveball, just a coherent step forward into new territory. And each album introduced stunning music too. The epic album closer Red Sky and the jaw-dropping music box off Visu are two of the best things Thrice had ever done. The band was in incredible creative form, and just how high was that form going to take them? Thrice had a good relationship with Island Records. They'd made 2 successful records together, and that's what the music biz is all about. But when Island tried to interfere, tried to mess with Thrice's sound, that relationship was over. Thrice were not having that. They signed with a label they could trust, Vagrant. A label that wasn't going to pester Thrice to write a radio-friendly hit. Although if Thrice wanted to do so, Vagrant probably wouldn't mind. But by now Thrice had a whirlwind of different ideas. How are they going to fit them all into one album? Well, maybe they wouldn't have to. Why write just one album when you can write 4? That's essentially what the guys did with the Alchemy Index. Based around the 4 elements of fire, water, air, and earth, the project gave Thrice the chance to go deep on different influences. They didn't need to temper anything, or dial anything back. They could go all out, dedicating an entire album to each musical style. Fire and Water came first, released as volumes 1 and 2 in 2006. Fire is fairly straightforward Thrice territory, with hardcore, screamo, and metal tracks. It's heavy, reminiscent of the likes of Pelican and The Refused. But there are also plenty of indie rock influence there too. Water is a gentler affair, featuring ambient electronic compositions and trip-hop influence. There are shades of Cirrose and Dentel here, but elements of classic pop also work themselves into all that glitchy electronica. 2 years later, Thrice finished the project, adding air and earth to the mix. Genre-wise, air is the hardest to pin down, as the band offers up a collection of pop-rock numbers and expansive post-rock tracks. Earth is Thrice's country folk record. This genre was particularly important to Dustin Kensrue. He had released his first solo album between the 2 halves of the Alchemy Index project, channeling the classic Americana of Johnny Cash and Townes Van Zandt on tracks like I Knew You Before and Pistol. It was a sprawling project, but it was a triumph. The no-holds-barred nature of dedicating an entire album to a specific genre could have veered into self-indulgence. But if there's a band we can trust with a task like this, it's Thrice. The post-hardcore geniuses delivered the goods yet again. But creating something as massive as this has got to be draining. Could the band keep up the pace and come back with another stunning record? Or was Thrice about to burn out? I'm sure Thrice enjoyed the Alchemy Index project, but it had taken years to record and release all that material. For the next record, they wanted to do something a bit more intermediate. It's no surprise then that 7th album Beggars was released barely a year later, in September 2009. The album emerged from jamming sessions, with all the band working on ideas together. While the Alchemy Index was a fractured project by nature, Beggars feels much more cohesive and even adopts bluesy elements in places, perhaps emerging out of the jam band method of writing the album. But this newfound unity didn't last. While working on 8th album Major Minor, the band found themselves writing different elements individually. It's still a great record, but maybe Thrice were beginning to run out of steam. Illusion of Safety wasn't even 10 years old, and the band had released 6 albums since then, or 8 if you split Alchemy Index up into 4. They might have been feeling a little exhausted, and so after touring Major Minor they decided to take a break. Thrice is not breaking up, Kensrue said in 2012, but we are taking a break from being a full-time band. But maybe it wasn't just exhaustion that led to the hiatus. Thrice were never a Christian band, but Dustin had always been clear about his own strong Christian faith. Finally finding himself with some downtime, Kensrue decided to dedicate himself more completely to his faith. He became a deacon at the Mars Hill Church in Orange County, California, before moving to Washington State to become the worship leader for the church's Bellevue campus. For a while, it seemed like this would spell the end of the Thrice story. Dustin had found a new calling, a higher calling, some might say. He spent 2 years with the church, finding spiritual rewards in his new role. But this new chapter would end bitterly. In 2014, Mars Hill co-founder Mark Driscoll found himself facing allegations of abusive behavior towards church staff and his own congregation. Dustin Kensrue was never accused of any such behavior, and by all accounts, he was a committed and ethical servant of the church. But the accusations against Driscoll and his subsequent resignation left Dustin disillusioned with the whole thing. In 2014, as Mars Hill was being dissolved, Dustin left the Bellevue campus behind for good. Meanwhile, the Breckenridge brothers were still playing music. Eddie joined up with Tom DeLonge and others in Angels and Airwaves, while Riley released a record with a gloriously bizarre baseball-themed grindcore band named Puke Destroyer, a play on the band Pig Destroyer and former LA Dodgers right fielder Yasiel Puke. The guys were also all still good friends. In 2015, Kensrue and Teranishi were at a brand new show when they had a revelation. We want to do that, they thought, just like we used to. That spark led to Tepe and Dustin quite literally getting the old band back together. It had nearly been game over, but now the next chapter of the Thrice story was just about to begin. Thrice roared back to life with another record for Vagrant in 2016. To be everywhere is to be nowhere is a little rawer and more ragged than other Thrice releases, and there's a real grunge thread running through all that classic post-hardcore. It's also more politically engaged. Social themes like inequality and prejudice emerge across the record as the band got to grips with the way the world had changed in the 5 years since the last record. This would be Thrice's final album with Vagrant. They left the label that year, joining up with legendary punk label Epitaph. Ever the prolific songsmiths, Thrice got straight back into the writing and recording cycle, releasing Palms in 2018. It's another expansive and diverse record from the post-hardcore titans, veering from crushing metal-tinged riffage to gentle, delicate piano compositions. The band followed this record with another for Epitaph, 2021's Horizons East. Even so far into their career, Thrice were still able to knock it out of the park, both on record and on stage. 2025 marks 27 years of Thrice. All the way back in the late 90s, the band featured Dustin Kensrue, Tepe Teranishi, Riley Breckenridge, and Eddie Breckenridge. And almost 3 decades later, it still features those same 4 guys. If you've ever seen any of my other videos, you'll know this is pretty rare. Bands tend to change members and shuffle lineups at the drop of a hat. So Thrice's story is one of friendship and a group of guys who seem to actually like each other, which is genuinely quite lovely. Honestly, I've covered so many pop-punk and emo bands, and it's really only Thrice and The Starting Line that have shared this kind of lasting bond. Check out my video on The Starting Line once you're through with this one. But the story is also about the possibilities of post-hardcore. When Thrice released Identity Crisis back in 2000, they basically perfected the genre of melodic hardcore punk. That would have been enough for most bands, and certainly would have been a great story to tell the grandkids. But it wasn't enough for Thrice. The strength of their artistic endeavor was just too powerful to resist. With basically every album they've released since then, and depending on how you're counting the Alchemy Index, that's either 10 or 12 full records, they've evolved, they've progressed, and they've pushed the genre forwards. Thrice is an example of how some bands don't get the stardom and accolades they deserve. Now, that's not to say that Thrice haven't made a good living out of what they do. They dropped Island, remember, not the other way around. And it's not to say they aren't critically acclaimed either. All of the records in Thrice's extensive back catalog have received rave reviews. It's just that, if we're going off the quality of the music alone, Thrice should have been megastars. Thrice should be known as scene game changers. But maybe it doesn't matter. Thrice have the artistic freedom and financial security to do whatever the hell they want. That's a win for them. And that's a win for us, too. So, which Thrice record is your favorite? Where do Thrice sit, in your opinion, in the pantheon of the all-time greats? Or do people like me overrate them? Let's talk about it in the comments, and please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, it really means a lot to get such a big response from these videos. And if you're in the mood for more post-hardcore explorations, I've got more of the same coming your way in just a moment.